Good afternoon, gentlemen. First of all, thank all of you for being here. I have to say, it's just an honor and a privilege and a joy to be here. And there are numerous people to thank, and Anne-Marie Lipinski and your entire team that have made this happen. The Pulitzer Board, in particular, shout out to the 2006 Pulitzer Board. I think you guys did a great job. Before we get going, I'll give the disclaimer. It's slightly different than what Dean gave to the previous session, and that is here at Harvard, amongst faculty, you might get long, complicated questions, and all you need to do is give me a knowing nod and saying, let me reflect on that, and you can answer however which way you want. Okay.
Fair enough.
Got the rules.
Got the rules. But Joby and Larry, two of the world's most celebrated experts on questions ranging from national security, terrorism, extremism, among other things. And it's really my pleasure to both moderate, and I have been told I'm the token historian here to keep you honest on the longue durée, so that we're not just thinking about in the present. We're not just thinking about events, but we're thinking about things as processes as well, as we're imagining our conversation, interrogating this theme of power in the world, along with what we mean by power. What forms of power can we identify? How do these engage with each other? Where is the West, if you will, in the broader configuration of the world today, and the directions and trends? In other words, sort of engaging questions about Western power and hegemony and the degrees to which the status quo remains. There is a waxing and waning in trends along the power axis. But let's begin our conversation, if you will, narrowly. And by this, I mean not narrowly in terms of impact, but narrowly in terms of time and place. And then we're going to open our aperture more widely. But September 11th, 2001, 15 years ago. Why does countering extremist ideology remain such a difficult challenge? 15 years after 9/11, with all of the evidence suggesting the problem's getting worse rather than better. And to what degree, and this is where the historian in me comes into this, to what degree is the question about extremism an old story in different times? We could be talking about rise of fascism in Europe. We could be talking about Menachem Begin and Zionist extremism in Palestine in the 1940s, Michael Collins in Ireland in the 1920s, Mau Mau in Kenya in the 1950s. So your thoughts on this?
Well, it just so happens, my day job, I'm still at the Washington Post, and this week I had to ask that question to a number of people who were serving at 9/11 and before 9/11, people like Dick Clark, who was National Security Advisor to the White House for Clinton and for Bush, and was raising the red flags and warning Americans about the dangers we face from radical extremist groups in the Middle East. And none of them expected to be fighting this problem that we're still fighting right now. Everybody assumed it was going to be, we're going to make our defenses better, we're going to harden our security, but eventually we're going to defeat this enemy. And yet 15 years later, Al-Qaeda still exists, but they've evolved. They've become much more adept in terms of changing their tactics to deal with new technology, to deal with social media. And now we've got this whole new strain, which is the Islamic State, which is a whole different animal entirely, and is likely to be around when we're sitting here 15 years from now talking about the same issues. It turns out that a couple of things we're not very good at, as the West, at sort of countering the radical messages, because we don't have the stature, we don't have a trustworthy voice to some of these groups. It has to come from the Muslim world. And we just don't have sort of the means to deal with it in the way that we anticipated that we would. Violence alone or force alone doesn't seem to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, there's a little memorial you may have passed outside. Somebody put out flags for the 3,000 Americans that died on this day. And it made me think about, that day, because it was certainly an important day in my life. And I talked to a survivor. The reason I'm bringing this story up is I think that a lot of what's going on with the continuing trauma that this country feels, and the narrative that you speak of that beckons to so many alienated young Muslims, has to do with this transgressive imagery that with 9/11, which began that. We saw things in real life we never thought we'd see outside of a movie theater. And I was stuck in Austin, where I live, trying to get to New York to find a way to get into the story. I had to do something. And I sent an email to, because the phones were down in New York for a while, I sent an email to David Remnick, the editor at the New Yorker, saying, put me to work. So we had a conference call when the phones got back on, and you could hear New Yorker colleagues who were stranded all over, on their stories. They were in different parts of the world, of the country. And David said, just find stories and bring them to me, and we'll meld them. And I found a young man named Kurt Yeltsin, who was a young reporter. And he had an interview that day at 9 o'clock in the morning at top of the World Trade Center. And he slept through his subway stop. It never happened before. So he woke up, he got turned around. If you'd never been in the World Trade Center, there was an escalator that went up to the elevator bank. There were more than 100 elevators. And so he raced up there, looking at his watch. The elevator attendant was holding the door for a very well put together businesswoman who was taking her time walking across the lobby. And just as she stepped into the elevator, Kurt noticed she had a rose tattoo on her ankle, and that's when the plane hit. And the doors accordioned, and nobody knew what, this was the last moment of innocence in a way. Nobody knew what it was. Was it an earthquake? A bomb? What could it be? And he walked out into the lobby, and he noticed objects on the floor. And just, pieces of concrete or plaster, and some were the size of an alarm clock, and some the size of a desk. And because he was disoriented, he saw outside, it turned out to be a terrace instead of, it wasn't the ground floor. And he walked out, and he looked out, and there were hundreds of shoes just lying there on the ground, and other things that looked like suitcases. And he realized they were torsos. And I spent hours and hours talking to this guy, then handing the tapes to my wife, who would weep as she typed up his story. And that became the bookend of the black issue of the New Yorker. Like most people, like Dick Clark, I never thought I'd be writing about terrorism 15 years later. And yet, I think that, this world has really shifted. We've become different people because of this threat, which is not really such a profound threat to our existence. America's not going to go away. We're not going to become disunited states, which was what bin Laden's fantasy was. That's not going to happen. But I think, in part, we feel entrapped in a movie not of our making. And that is what is so empowering to these young Muslims who are being drawn into this very exciting, historic enterprise, where in so many cases their own lives offer them so little.
I want to pick up on a few of these points, but one thing struck me as we're close to each other, and that is 15 years later, as you were talking about just now, the transcription of these tapes. And I could see it in your face and in your eyes about the power that this has as the journalist, as the writer. Can you talk a little bit more about how those stories have affected you and the ways in which it affected you in the writing of your book that won the Pulitzer Prize, and the way in which it affects you now as someone who has moved on to other projects? Because I certainly know from my own experience, quite differently, I never anticipated the kinds of horrific stories of torture, rape, hundreds of hours of this collected. And what it does to you as a human being. How can you not be compassionate? We heard about compassion earlier today. So perhaps you can talk to us a little more about that.
Joby and I were talking about this yesterday as we were walking over here, how you get caught up in the tragedies of other people's. And I think I love the job of being a reporter. It's great because you get to go out in the world and you find stories. And when on 9/11, when I was looking for a way to take this vast tragedy and make it human, I always I always look for individuals whose stories can embody a larger story. I call these individuals donkeys. It sounds disparaging, but in my mind, a donkey is a useful beast of burden who can carry a lot of information on his back. So I was, because I was still stranded in Austin, I started going through the obituaries that were streaming online, and on the Washington Post site, I found the obituary of John O'Neill. And he had been head of counterterrorism in New York. He had the warrant on bin Laden. And the obituary made him sound like something of a disgrace because he had been washed out of the Bureau having taken classified information out of the office. And he became the head of security at the World Trade Center. And his friends, at first I thought, how ironic. He didn't get bin Laden got him. And I didn't know if he was a hero or a villain, but I thought he's a great donkey. He can take the reader into the world of counterterrorism and show us, why it failed. But I had no idea what an extraordinary character he was. And his friends told him, John, you'll be safe now, because they tried to bomb the Trade Center in 1993. And he said, no, they'll come back to finish the job. So it wasn't ironic, it was Greek. He had intentionally placed himself at ground zero. Spent 5 years going around the Middle East and South Asia, trying to find out what had happened. And naturally, you're running into people whose, I can't tell you how many times I've been so grateful to have that passport, to be able to get on the plane and leave behind all the problems that the people that I'm talking to are having to deal with. But of course it sits on your shoulders. But that's our job, is to go out, find those stories, bring them back, and give them to our readers.
It's interesting. I want to move back to you, Joby, on a point where you brought about the sort of the continuation, if you will, in your conversation about that. But it's interesting. I think in journalists, in many ways, I'm a trained academic, but as an historian, we're not trained in that per se. And I think you referred to it as the donkeys, and I think about the hundreds of different people that I interviewed, and you simply have to pick, narratively speaking, as you're writing your narrative history, what is the best rape story that fits in this chapter right now? And you read through, and it's a very odd way to be thinking about the research that one conducts and the ways in which it affects one. But back to you, Joby, and switching gears a little bit, did it strike you as naive, this response, that we didn't expect this to be, that we would sort of snuff this out? Think about the IRA. The IRA, and again, this is, sort of drawing upon other examples. IRA sort of springs up, and some of the genesis is in the late 19th century. It wreaks havoc for the British for frankly, decades. And we could go through other kinds of organizations. Is this American hubris that imagines they're just going to snuff this out in a very short period of time?
No, I just remember the outrage that a lot of these security officials felt. It was like the bee stinging the elephant with this tiny, nobody took Al-Qaeda seriously, just as people didn't take ISIS very seriously until recently. A bunch of people, as we used to say all the time back then, living in caves. It turns out it was a little bit more sophisticated than that, but in a backward country with no infrastructure, and that they were able to pull this off. And so of course we're going to be able to squash them, and it wouldn't take very long. It wouldn't take a lot of resources. And then the initial narrative after 9/11 sort of proved that, because our victory against the Taliban initially was done with a very few Americans, mostly with the Afghan militias, and without much loss of life at all, and not even much air power required.
And yet it had stopped.
Yeah, but then it gets dragged into something else, and then we as Americans and as Westerners more generally managed to stimulate this very phenomenon that we're trying to stop with our own actions, talking particularly about Iraq, but in other ways as well, that we've certainly fanned the flames, and we've made it a harder target over time.
Larry, did you want to jump in?
Well, when we talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, we've been through, you ask, we've been through this in our history. Yes, we have, but this war in Afghanistan and Iraq, those are the longest wars we've ever fought. And, longer than Vietnam and World War II put together. And over a span of time, placing our country on a war footing in a war that has no discernible end and not even clear how it would end or what terms it would be. But we're constantly in a state of security. And I'm not saying that we can't be, we have to be cautious. There are measures that we've taken that have made us safer. I'm not saying that I would take back all of them. I would repeal some of them perhaps. But what bothers me is that there are young people who don't know America before 9/11. They don't really know what the country was like before we became the country that we are now. And I often reflect on the fact that I took a date when I was in high school in Dallas, Texas, to the airport. And when you didn't have any money, it was a place you could go. And it's called Love Field. We walked out on the tarmac and climbed up into one of these jetliners that had just come in from, we decided, Paris. And we sat in the first class section, and a stewardess, as we called them then, brought us a snack. And then we went up in the FAA tower. Hi, kids, come on in. Well, that was America. It's gone. That kind of, you have to take off your shoes and your belt when you go to the Liberty Bell. I mean, you get your picture made when you walk into an office building. Those are liberties. There's so many different kinds of liberties that we talk about fighting for liberty, but we've compromised our liberties. Mm-hmm. And in the process, we've changed our culture. But if we don't keep in our hearts the idea of that other America, where we had those kinds of liberties and lived in a community of trust and safety, then we really will have lost something in this war on terror.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to this point in a moment on sort of the long drawn-out wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, because as an historian who studies the British Empire, this surprises me not in the least. But picking up on this, and I also remember this. You'd sort of go to the airport, and you'd run down, and you'd greet mom and dad coming off the plane, right at the gate, awaiting the presents that they came back with you with. But accountability. For those of us who do remember the before and after, because there are many of us, we know the failure of the CIA to notify the FBI of al-Qaeda in the United States, 20 months or so prior to 9/11. 50 or 60 people knew about this. And yet there have been efforts more recently, congressional bills to scapegoat the Saudis. Why isn't anyone holding the US government accountable? Why are Americans not demanding not just more accountability with this, with 9/11, with this knowledge, with this failure, but with Iraq? Mm-hmm. What is it that's happening that, and I think your wonderful vignette of the before and after, where is the accountability and the demand for it?
Well, it's not in government right now. And I think the press has moved on to more current problems, and we got the presidential election occupying our attention. But it hasn't escaped notice that, when the U.S. makes a mistake, it can be a big mistake. And Iraq and Afghanistan together, depending on how you account them, $4 to $6 trillion. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders could have spent all that money, if we, but I mean, think about how useful that money could. I'm just setting the bloodletting aside for a moment, but the $5 trillion, the entire amount of money that we spent on cancer research since the Nixon administration was $600 million. Our total health bill every year is $2.5 trillion. Half of the, just think about the utility of that money. Instead, what did it go to? It went to destruction. It made the world worse. It created enemies for us. We invested in misery, in creating misery. And no one has been held to account for that.
And I think the other new phenomenon since, well, before 9/11, but certainly since then, is just this commentary on just how partisan we are now as a society, that everything that happens is measured in terms of whether it's our team or the other team, and whether it's good because we did it or it's bad because those guys did it. You look at everything from the Iraq War and to Benghazi and everything in between. It's all measured in how can we use it to blame the other side? Can we use it to score points? And not looking for real, honest facts that people can all agree on.
Right.
And that's just the sort of the unfortunate change in our own society over the last 10, 15 years.
Absolutely, and I want to come back to this question about partisanship because it's clearly front and center in some of this conversation. But to your point about the money spent, now I think one of the things many things I've learned in the course of today in the various panels and talking about power and accountability, but overall what struck me is that we haven't talked so much today about capitalism, Wall Street. Now, Eisenhower, about 5 decades ago, warned about the military-industrial complex. And in many ways, this has reached a critical mass, at least for now. I'm sure it's only going to get worse. This is a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry. Corporate war-making agencies are bought and sold by Fortune 500 companies. Governments, even the UN, outsource. Nation-state boundaries no longer contain political economies. The business of war is big business. What happens to this conversation when we suddenly take capitalism as a form of power and put it in the center of our conversation, along with politics and the military when we think about accountability?
Well, there's a new layer to that too, in terms of U.S. corporations involved in influencing this struggle in ways that we probably didn't think about before, which is social media. And the current conflict with ISIS, I mean, they've essentially been fueled by Twitter, by Facebook, by Telegram. It's all these social media channels, almost all of them owned and operated by Western entrepreneurs, and they've factored into this conflict in surprising ways. And some of them have tried to be good citizens and tried to stop, sort of this hateful traffic, but it's been either beyond their capability or maybe beyond their desire, because it still happens every day, and every one of those terrible messages and videos that we see just are spread rampantly around the world. And people are making money off of that as well, not just the guns and the contracts.
There's no doubt that we've created a security state, and there is an investment in keeping us scared. And there are reasons to be frightened. But I think, since I'm from Texas, I'll tell you a story you may not have heard recently. In Alpine, Texas, there was a tragedy the other day, a real one. A high school girl killed a friend and then shot herself. Yeah. And, but given that it was a school shooting, the deputy sheriff comes and Homeland Security, and they get there at the wrong time. The deputy sheriff shoots a guy from Homeland Security, and then there are bomb threats that just arise out of the LOL land, and so the whole town, a small town of Alpine, is frightened and up in arms. And in nearby Marathon, there was a motel, and the guest had handwritten a "Do Not Disturb" sign, and then in parentheses "La Bomba," and put that out. And the motel owner called the police, and once the Homeland Security, turns out La Bomba is Tex-Mex for hot sex. So I can only imagine how that hot sex cooled off.
On war and accountability, you bring in hot sex. Mary for the win.
Yes,
but the state of mind, I think, in the country is reflected in those weird instances where everybody's on edge, even in far west Texas.
Yeah, I think and in some ways, let's marry that with your point about partisanship, right? Because I think in some ways these speak to one another. And in case you haven't heard, Obama created ISIS. Care to comment?
Well, it's we haven't been able to verify it. But again, it's just an example of how everything is boiled down to the most simple sound bites and a bludgeon to use against your opponents. And so the claim is just ridiculous on its face, and yet it's repeated again and again by this same individual. And there are a lot of people who believe it, and not just in this country, but God knows, Larry knows this as well as I do, but you go overseas and there are plenty of conspiracy theories out there, and this just fits right into the narrative that a lot of them have anyway, that ISIS is somehow created by Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United States, and then it's just craziness. And yet it's almost accepted and expected now that it's going to be the way you score points, and nobody cares about the underlying details. Just boil it down to the 140 character tweet, and that's kind of the new way of having a conversation.
Reflecting on the conspiracy theories in the Middle East, we've become them, kind of. You know, our country is turning. This Egyptian playwright, Ali Salam, once told me. He had this big rubbery face and this deep voice. He said, "The United States has now become a Middle Eastern country, and you're going to have to think very old thoughts." And I do feel a lot of times, you know, that these, you know, they're looking for material to support their own prejudices. And one of my sources was one of bin Laden's brothers-in-law, and he had been disowning bin Laden and his thoughts, and, you know, even writing editorials, and then suddenly changed. And I called him. I said, "Jamal, what's going on? You've gone crazy again." And he said, "Well, you know, it's your own people that are saying you did it. Why should I assume responsibility?"
Yeah, listening to you, I mean, in reading your works, you're both experts on extremism in different forms, right? And to this point, it's raised often in the fault lines of sort of failures of the nation state, which, we've chatted about this before, right? A nation state is a reasonably new phenomena on a relative basis. Empires and caliphates, centuries, if we look over time. But be that as it may, the idea that somehow religion is entering in on these fault lines of failed nation states, but to what degree, based on your experiences, are we just talking about variations of the same thing in terms of these extremism, right? Ernest Gellner, famous sort of scholar, theoretician, writes about nationalism, that a nation getting its history wrong is part of being a nation. And to what degree, whether it's nationalism or religion, we're talking about culture and affect and belief in different kinds of forms. And the questions about sort of the race to the basement, which is better or worse, I think is the wrong question to ask. So my question to both of you is, how do you see these engaging with one another? You're talking about the ways in which sort of, almost thinking, we're thinking about religion in the Middle East. We're sort of tongue-in-cheek talking about Obama as the founder of ISIS. But both of these are enormous threats. They're extremism. How do you read this into the landscape of the kinds of fears that Americans have, but not just Americans, people around the world? And I want to sort of take us more globally in a moment, thinking about refugees in Aleppo and other kinds of places.
Well, I think what's interesting about the Islamic State is it sort of rejects the idea of the traditional nation state, and all these sort of models that have risen over the last century for governance in the Middle East are obsolete as far as they're concerned. They're looking to erase the last century of history, and they're even doing more than that. They want to create this caliphate, but their eye really is on the return of they want to essentially bring in the apocalypse, and that's what they literally think they're trying to do at the moment. And so you've got this culture within the Islamic State that views all governments that we know in the region as illegitimate, and people who don't agree with them as apostates who need to be destroyed or pushed back. And they've got a very clear vision, and it's one that resonates not just with sort of the people in the slums, but with educated men and women, doctors and lawyers and scientists who feel that this is kind of a necessary readjustment of history. And it's kind of frightening to see what their vision is, and just have to hope that they're never able to accomplish it. But it's a new moment, I think. This is a new phenomenon that I think we're seeing right now.
I think these are in large part issues of identity. And when we talk about a nation state, to some extent, you can measure the strength of that by saying, what are you? Well, I'm an American, or I'm a Texan, or something like that, where your affiliation is. And so if you are a young man named Mohammed, and you're living in Belgium, for instance, by the way, Mohammed is the most common given name for children now born in Belgium. You may not feel Flemish, or you may not, and you may not speak Arabic, but you don't feel affiliated with the culture that you find yourself in. And France is also a frightening example, because you have, according to the State Department, France has an estimated 10% of its population is Muslim. 70% of their prisoners are Muslims. Can you imagine a starker measure of alienation? And so they don't feel French, and the French don't feel they're French either. So it's not surprising that they go to the mosque and they affiliate with their religion. If you ask them, what are you? They say, I'm a Muslim. And so that's the very first degree of association. And once in that environment, it's also not surprising that people become radicalized. Because, especially in a religious context, religion is dangerous because there is an element that for lack of a better word, I call piety, which is competitive. And you gain power by believing more strongly. And so the stronger you believe, the more you're respected. And in a religious context, radicalization takes place very easily.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, at least as I'm hearing the two of you, and I'm going to ask you in a moment to kind of get out your crystal balls for us, to see where, what's the end game to this. But certainly, as an historian, nationalism, ethnicity, tribalism, these are all variants of the same thing. Identities, and identities that are very consciously created and disseminated, often particularly, and we can look across the colonial landscape, whether it be with the British or the French or elsewhere, policies of divide and rule, policies of creating, we were talking earlier about the Hutus and the Tutsis, that's an extreme example, but this story never ends well.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm hearing, and part a little bit from you earlier, Joby, that there are things that are different today. So, how does this look different from, and getting back to Iraq and Afghanistan it does not surprise me in the least. The Americans, the blueprint for Petraeus, was Malaya. And Malaya was a disaster. But the British somehow, the mythology is that the British civilizing mission somehow or another got counterinsurgency right. And for the most part, they were unsuccessful in every single place. And these were long, drawn-out wars, and I raised the IRA, and we talked about Palestine, but each one of these. So, what's different about today? How does this story end differently for the 21st century than perhaps in other wars, other times, other places?
I think it's important to remember, too, that this still remains a small fringe within the greater Muslim community, certainly, and within the countries that we visit. The polls, very fortunately show that support for the ideology of the Islamic State and these other radical groups remains in sometimes the low single percentages. But and yet it's a transnational appeal that, as Larry was saying, affects people that feel disaffected anyway in these countries, not just in Europe, but also in the region, who don't really feel they're Jordanian, that really don't understand what Jordan is, because it's a new entity. It didn't exist 100 years ago. There's no real Jordan nationality. So what is this artificial place where they live? Who are these governments or these despots, monarchs who are leading their countries? Are they legitimate, or are they puppets of the West? And a lot of people believe that they are. So it's a small, but it's an important minority, even if it's 10, 15% in some cases, that's still a lot of people who feel they don't really have a home in the world. And so these ideologies are very appealing to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are two things that concern me in the future. The first, I think, is the refugees. Just to take the example of Syria, we have 5 million Syrians who are out of their country. Not to count like 11 million dislocated inside their country. And they're part of a larger refugee stream. UNICEF claims that there are half of all the world's refugees are children, and there are 50 million children who are refugees, and only 20% of them have been educated. Well, that's a huge reservoir of despair. And it's almost impossible to pin one thing as being the source of terrorism. But in a collective sense, despair would be a pretty good word to cover, what gives rise to terror. And I think the world has done a shoddy job of trying to attend to this vast pool of desperate people. The entire Palestinian diaspora was 750,000 people. And look at how much unhappiness that they've experienced and have caused in the world. We have a geometric progression beyond that. And the other thing that is concerning to me is technology, in much of which we've created in the war on terror. And now we have drones flying over the White House fence, But the template that Al-Qaeda created of a small, highly empowered group that can affect world history, that is contagious. And I think we should take the idea of terror out of the context simply of Islam, because it could be like Aum Shinrikyo, who was a blind Japanese yoga instructor. You never know when the genie is going to land. And that, I think, had it been allowed to, it could have been much more dangerous than Al-Qaeda. So I think we have to look at the fact that technology has empowered people, individuals, and groups to do far more damage now than they have done in the past.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to pick up on that, on technology, but I do want to come back to your very important point on refugees. And, we raised the partisanship and sort of questions in the current election campaign, and I'm sure the biggest gaffe is going to go down as in what is Aleppo, right? But getting beyond just the politics of the gaffe, what does that statement from a presidential candidate who is a libertarian tell us about where refugees, and your points are very well taken, 50 million. I've been, like you, to refugee camps in places like Kenya. Extraordinary. You cannot help. You're inhuman if you're not affected by this. And yet, and this is going to take me also as we're winding up to my last question about technology, but to stay on this, Robert Caro reminded us today so eloquently about those who have regard for power and have power, and also the disregard for those without power. This problem isn't going to end anytime soon. And if we marry that with the question of technology, and I think we'll sort of perhaps end on this point, I think I'm much less optimistic than you are, Joby, and maybe it's the cynicism of an historian who has studied too many wars and too much creation of ethnic tension, too much creation of, and sort of, frankly, 60, 70 years ago, it wasn't necessarily the military-industrial complex, but rather it was all kinds of other economic interests that were invested. But the combination of refugees, this growing, you're talking about the small size, but this, what's a solution that marries or that we can graft onto the extremism of nationalism? In other words, it's not just about the numbers, but it's also about partisanship. It's also about politics, right? What's the end game with this ever-expanding number of refugees who desperately, from a compassionate standpoint, needs the world's attention, and from a very self-interested standpoint, this community, and I do not agree, and I would imagine neither do you, that these are necessarily hotbeds for terrorism, but the disenfranchised, the marginalized, at some point will need and demand their rights and their attention. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right now, we have, I think, 2 million Syrians in Turkey, 1 million in Jordan. 1 out of 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. These are nominal allies of ours in the region, and that demography is enough to capsize those governments. There's no telling how that's going to change in the near future. And I haven't even mentioned but Europe is under tremendous pressure, culturally and politically and economically. And so I think this whole region, the gates have opened. Desperate people are fleeing desperate situations, and they are causing desperation where they go. I think America's done a very poor job of taking on our part. Yes, it's dangerous. Refugees are not immigrants in the usual sense of the word. They come usually with nothing except their own trauma. But at the end of Vietnam, we took in 175,000 people that we deemed important, and then the boat people followed that. So now we have a community of 1 million Vietnamese people who have added substantially to our culture and are rather well off. The Mariel boat lift. Here was 170,000 people that got out of the, Fred Cuba and Fidel Castro thoughtfully threw in the mentally insane and emptied the prisons and so on. And yes, there were problems. But out of that, we got a Pulitzer Prize winner, we got a major league ball player, we got an opera singer. And Miami absorbed that. We can absorb more, but there will be dangers, but the status quo, to leave these people unattended, that's far more dangerous than assuming the responsibility of trying to take care of them.
Yeah, and that goes not just for accepting refugees in this country, but also dealing with a huge problem. We ended up with Al-Qaeda because we walked away from a situation in Afghanistan that so the Soviets left. We felt victorious, and so we walked away, and we got a security vacuum in which a group like Al-Qaeda was able to grow. And the problem is exponentially worse right now in Iraq and Syria, where you have 6 million Syrian refugees alone. You got cities that, who's going to rebuild Aleppo, even let alone find it on a map? And these are areas where this is the material from which the next major terrorist problem or next sort of failed region. This is the epicenter I think we're looking at right now. And there's really nobody talking about a solution that makes sense.
Well, gentlemen, I can't imagine anything I like more than spending my Sunday afternoon sincerely speaking with the two of you. We could go on. We've had wonderful conversations before this, and I hope they continue afterward. But most of all, I want to thank the two of you for wonderful insights, and also, most importantly, for your work and the ways in which you have made critical interventions that have been so importantly recognized by the Pulitzer Board. So thank you so much.